So if you were asked to organize this set of objects into smaller groups, how would you do it? That was the question that a colleague and I asked a group of non-literate women from a low-income community in Bangalore, India, several years ago. And what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the background to why we were even asking this question. So Indrani Mehdi, who you see on the right, and I, at the time, we were working with this community to see whether we could set up a computer kiosk in one of the nonprofits that operated in that area so that women from this particular community could come and browse informal work that might be available for them. They did household chores like cleaning, cooking, and childcare, and so on. And one of the things about them was that they were unable to read for the most part. And so as a computer scientist, and Indrani was a designer, we wanted to see if we could design a computer user interface that would be usable by people who couldn't read. Here's one of the screenshots of something that we came up with. And as you can see, and as might be obvious, there's not a lot of text. But as we were doing this project, we learned a lot of new things about this particular community, as well as about people who are non-literate in general. And some of these things were a little bit surprising. So for example, at least with these particular women, we found that they were quite facile with numbers. They routinely did very quick arithmetic. They could read numbers and so on. So illiteracy didn't necessarily mean innumeracy. Another thing we found when we were designing this kind of interface was that simplified icons didn't work well because they were very prone to misinterpretation. And on the other hand, photographs didn't work well either because people would take them to be the actual instance of the object rather than a generalized class of thing or action. Yet another thing we found was that even when the participants we worked with could understand the individual components of this kind of interface, they still didn't get this overall idea of how a machine, a futuristic machine, could end up with information about the jobs that they cared about. And so we ended up creating something that we called full context video, in which we told a little story where a middle-class couple are looking for a maid, and they go to their own laptop, type in the information, and eventually it finds its way to another computer in the community that these women happen to live in. Now, one of the most surprising things that we encountered was that an assumption that we had made that just seemed completely obvious to us about the way computer interfaces tend to work was completely alien to many of our participants. So most of us have used interfaces where there's usually a menu. If you click on job, you'd expect to see a sub-menu appear. There might be jobs that say cleaning jobs, cooking jobs, childcare jobs, and so on. But this kind of hierarchical organization, it turns out, is not necessarily intuitive to other groups of people. So this takes us back to exactly this question of how would you group these objects? Now, my guess is if you're anything like me, and all of us here are literate and have fairly high standards of formal education, and as a result, it would be very obvious to you that you should group these objects like I've done here, where you have all of the kitchen utensils together, all of the people together, and all of the farm animals together. Now, I know this group has a lot of artists, and so you might say, I really want to break this kind of organization and think of something new. But even then, you would be reacting to a knee-jerk response that most of us would have in terms of grouping these kinds of things. Now, when we asked the women in this particular community the same exact question, some of them answered like this, but a surprising number said something completely different. So they would tell us things like this. They would say, well, last month, my uncle came over to visit, and we slaughtered a goat with a knife. And so obviously, those three things go together. And meanwhile, last week, my sister just had a baby, and so now I find that anytime she's grinding spices, she's always carrying the baby with her. Now, I have to tell you that when I first saw this, and actually witnessed it from my own eyes, I thought this was completely ridiculous. It just did not seem to make any sense. It seems so obvious that there are obvious groupings to this. But if you think about it a little bit, there are no labels in the real world where objects and actions come with predetermined categories. Classification is something that human beings do on top of the world as it is. And so, of course, being academics and researchers, we went back to the literature and tried to see if other people had encountered a similar phenomenon. And in fact, they had. For decades, there's been research on what psychologists call oral cultures. And it turns out that, for example, the famous Soviet psychologist Alexander Luria actually conducted a very similar experiment with Russian non-literate peasants and found almost identical results. One of the preeminent scholars in this area was a man who was trained as a psychiatrist. His name was Walter Ong, but most of his research career was focused on this idea of understanding oral cultures, and specifically how they differed from what he called chirographic cultures, cultures that have text and literacy. In a book that he wrote in 1982 called Orality and Literacy, he basically said that as literate people, we really have a hard time understanding oral cultures. We are so literate that it is difficult for us to conceive of an oral universe of communication or thought, except as a variant of a literate universe. And he said that, we tend to have this knee-jerk instinct to try to think of people in oral cultures as horses, thinking of horses as automobiles without wheels, which is obviously a very poor analogy. Now, in his book, he went through a whole list of different ways in which oral cultures thought about things and expressed things very different from literate cultures. And I want to give you just 3 examples of those. So one of them is that in oral cultures, mnemonic aids are highly, highly valued because obviously everything that you know has to be remembered, and when it's transmitted, it has to be transmitted in a way that's also easy to remember for the listener. In fact, there is a theory about Homeric epic poetry that a large amount of the style of epic poetry is actually devoted to making it easier for somebody to remember the entire poem. Now, in literate cultures, we tend to see exactly these kinds of mnemonic aids, such as rhyming or alliteration or repetition or even cliche, as being something you want to avoid. But in oral cultures, these are valued, and they're often seen as exactly the things that you need when you're relating ideas. Another key difference is that in oral cultures, people tend to speak of things very much in concrete, real terms, things that you can touch, things that are tangible, whereas in literate cultures, we tend to very quickly move on from concrete instances to generalized abstractions. And the third thing, which I tend to see as a kind of overarching theme of all of these differences, is that in oral cultures, people value narrative rather than hierarchical, kind of logical organization of ideas. And this is not to say that in literate cultures we don't value narrative, but one feature of oral cultures is that everything is in narrative. So one of the things that we found anecdotally with working with these women was that you could sometimes ask them a relatively simple question that you thought deserved really a quick yes or no answer, and they would launch into a whole story to explain how they thought about that situation. And so it's not just that that narrative exists, as much as that narrative is the way by which people communicate just about everything. So if you think about things in this way, then all of a sudden this kind of categorization suddenly starts to make a little bit more sense. People are not thinking in terms of abstract categories, but in terms of actual experiences they've had and how things happen to associate in those actual experiences. Now, what does this have to do with anything? So in my work, for the last 15 years or so, I have been looking at different ways to use digital technology for the sake of socioeconomic development of poor communities around the world. In this work, we use everything from mobile phones to personal computers, the internet, sometimes custom hardware we build ourselves for the purposes of healthcare, governance, education, agriculture, and so on. And over the years, I've learned several things when working with various less educated communities around the world. The first one is that storytelling is ubiquitous, and arguably, it is actually a much more dominant way of communication than the one that we as literate researchers tend to think of, which is in very abstracted generalizations. This is a street theater troupe in Pakistan where they are basically telling a story as a way to convey the idea and help people come to a conclusion that child marriage might be something that they should do less of. There are communities in sub-Saharan Africa where even despite all of the mass media that is available today, there are still families that pass on stories about their ancestors through storytelling sessions between generation to generation. And this is not something that's limited to exotic places outside the United States. Within the United States, there are plenty of sub-communities that still rely heavily on a storytelling tradition. And you could argue that even in almost everyday public discussion, that a lot of our politics is actually much more focused on stories that our leaders tell us rather than on statistics or on specific policy recommendations that people have. The second thing that we've partly learned and partly were inspired by in doing this kind of work is that digital devices are everywhere. So sometime in the last 2 or 3 years, the world crossed an interesting threshold, which is to say that the number of mobile phone accounts in the world exceeded the total human population. Okay, now that doesn't mean that everyone in the world has a phone, because many people have multiple accounts, but you can now go to some very remote communities and find cell towers or people with smartphones, even where there is no running water or no electricity. And what's amazing about this is that just the sheer spread and how short a time it took. There's a very strong argument to be made that the mobile phone is probably the most successful and widely used consumer device ever in the history of human civilization. And then the third lesson that I've learned about all of this work is that even though technology can often be used as a way to support socioeconomic development, the technology itself is very rarely the prime impetus for any kind of positive social change. So whether it is an attempt to use storytelling and videos as a way to help people find better livelihoods, or using how-to videos also wrapped in stories as a way to help farmers learn better agricultural techniques. One thing that we find consistently is that in the end, people change not because of technology, but because of each other. And I'm very both honored and humbled and grateful for the National Academies Keck Futures Initiative in that they have provided us with a grant to explore this idea further, particularly in the context of maternal health, where we will be working with women in Pakistan, in South Africa, and in a country that surprisingly has a very low performance in terms of maternal and child mortality, and that's the United States. And in all of these places, what we will be doing is looking for ways to use digital technology as a channel through which storytelling can happen to help mothers learn the health care that they need for their own and their children's health. So I'm a computer scientist, I'm a scientist and engineer, and I would love to see the technology being used in positive ways other than, for example, fake news. But one thing I've learned is that in the end, because so much of the work that we're trying to do is dependent on human beings supporting other human beings, we need to collaborate with humanists and with artists who really understand much better than we do how to tell a good story and how to embed messages in stories in a way that doesn't come off as being overly didactic. So storytelling, which is definitely more art than science, I think is a way by which people who have knowledge can be connected to people who actually need that knowledge. Thank you very much.